Your mother is going to leave this house, whether you like it or not.
The dining room looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a home. Soft piano music drifted quietly from hidden speakers. Crystal glasses reflected warm gold light across the table. Every plate had been arranged perfectly by the house staff almost an hour earlier. But nobody was eating. Ethan sat near the center of the long table, his hands resting beside untouched silverware. Across from him, his wife Vivian calmly folded her napkin onto her lap, as though she were preparing to discuss business. At the far end of the table, Ethan's mother Margaret kept her eyes lowered toward her plate. Nobody spoke for several seconds, and somehow, the silence itself felt rehearsed. Then Vivian finally lifted her wine glass. "I think it's time we make a necessary change." Her voice was soft, controlled, the kind of tone people used when they already believed the conversation was over before it began. Ethan looked up slowly. Vivian met his eyes directly. "Your mother cannot stay here anymore." Margaret's fingers froze around her fork. No shouting followed the sentence. No dramatic music. No immediate argument. That almost made it worse. Ethan blinked once, trying to process the calmness in her voice. "What?" Vivian took a small sip of wine before answering. "She's unhappy here. We're all unhappy here." Margaret immediately shook her head. "No, sweetheart, I don't want any true." Vivian interrupted gently. "This isn't about trouble." But the smile on her face never reached her eyes. "It's about peace." Another silence settled across the table. Heavy, uncomfortable. Margaret slowly lowered her gaze again. Ethan stared at his wife, struggling to understand how a sentence spoken so quietly could suddenly make the entire room feel cold. Then Vivian added something that tightened the discomfort even further. "I already made arrangements." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "What arrangements?" Vivian calmly cut another piece of food. "For your mother." Later that evening, the mansion had become almost unnaturally quiet. Ethan walked down the long guest hallway toward the east wing, where Margaret had been staying since her health scare 3 months earlier. The farther he walked, the more distant the house felt. Not empty, controlled. He reached her room and knocked softly. Margaret opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been standing there waiting. She tried to smile when she saw him, but her eyes were red. "Your wife didn't mean to upset you," she said gently. That sentence hurt Ethan more than the dinner conversation itself. Not because of what she said, because of how quickly she defended someone who had just humiliated her. Ethan stepped inside slowly. "You don't have to leave." Margaret avoided his eyes. "She built this life with you. She doesn't get to throw you out." Margaret hesitated, then quietly asked, "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came out, because deep down, part of him already knew something had been wrong in this house long before tonight. And for the first time, he was beginning to realize everybody else had noticed it before he did. Before we go further, if you've been following stories like this on Chaos of Lives, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Margaret slowly sat on the edge of the bed. Ethan finally noticed 2 large suitcases standing beside the bedroom door. Already packed. His expression changed immediately. "I didn't pack those." Margaret looked away, and somewhere downstairs, he heard Vivian laughing quietly on the phone. The following morning, Vivian Hale looked flawless on television. A local morning program played softly across multiple screens inside her downtown corporate office, while assistants moved carefully around her schedule. On screen, Vivian smiled warmly beside a charity banner supporting elderly care initiatives across the city. The irony would have sounded unbelievable to anyone who had sat at the dinner table the night before. "She's one of the city's most admired businesswomen," the host said proudly. Vivian tilted her head modestly. "I believe family should always be protected." Ethan stood silently near the office doorway watching the interview end. She noticed him immediately, and within seconds, Her public warmth disappeared. Not dramatically, just subtly enough to feel disturbing. "You left early," she said. "You embarrassed my mother." Vivian calmly signed paperwork without looking up. "Your mother embarrassed herself." Ethan stared at her. There it was again. That strange emotional contradiction. No rage. No guilt. Just calm correction. Like she genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong. Then her assistant entered quietly. "The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Vivian nodded. As Ethan turned to leave, she spoke again. "You should think carefully before forcing me into an impossible situation." He stopped walking. Forcing her? The words stayed with him long after he left the office. Because somehow, she had already positioned herself as the victim. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone inside his parked car outside the office building. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. After several seconds of hesitation, he called his younger sister Claire. She answered immediately. What did she do this time? Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Claire sighed heavily on the other end. It means you only call me after Vivian does something cruel and you finally notice it. Ethan leaned back slowly. You think she's cruel? Claire gave a small bitter laugh. You really still don't see it? The comment irritated him immediately. But underneath the irritation, something else appeared. Fear. Claire continued carefully. She isolated you first. That's not true. Ethan, when was the last time you saw your college friends? He didn't answer. When was the last family holiday you attended without her controlling everything? Still no answer. Claire's voice softened. She didn't separate you from people overnight. That's why you missed it. Ethan looked down at the steering wheel silently. Because suddenly, he couldn't remember exactly when his world had become so small. That afternoon, the mansion felt different once Ethan started paying attention. Not larger, colder. The signs had always been there. He just hadn't looked closely enough before. Margaret quietly carried tea from the kitchen toward the sitting room. One of the newer house staff immediately intercepted her. Oh, Mrs. Hale asked that guests use the east sitting area instead. Margaret stopped awkwardly. I was only bringing tea. The young employee looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry. Margaret smiled politely anyway. It's all right. But Ethan noticed the embarrassment on her face immediately. Later, he overheard another conversation near the kitchen corridor. One staff member whispered quietly to another. Ma'am said the old woman probably won't be here much longer anyway. Ethan froze. The staff noticed him instantly and fell silent. But the damage had already been done. Because now he was starting to realize something deeply unsettling. Vivian's behavior wasn't impulsive. It was organized. And somehow, everyone in the house already understood the rules except him. Years earlier, Ethan first met Vivian during the worst financial period of his life. At the time, he was working long hours managing logistics for a struggling transportation company barely staying afloat after corporate restructuring. The charity fundraiser had been small. Nothing glamorous. Just local donors, business sponsors, and community volunteers gathered inside a modest hotel ballroom. Vivian stood out immediately, not because she was wealthy, because she listened carefully. Most people at events like that waited for their turn to speak. Vivian studied people instead. When Ethan accidentally spilled part of his drink while reaching for paperwork, she smiled softly instead of reacting with annoyance. Nervous. A little. That's usually a sign someone still cares. The answer stayed with him. Over the next several weeks, she appeared unexpectedly thoughtful, sending meals to his office, helping him network professionally, remembering small details nobody else noticed. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, and after spending most of his adult life struggling financially, Vivian felt safe. A few months into the relationship, Margaret invited Vivian for dinner at her small suburban home. The evening itself went smoothly. Too smoothly. Vivian complimented everything. The food, the house, the family photographs, Ethan's childhood stories. Margaret smiled politely throughout dinner. But later that night, while washing dishes quietly beside Ethan, she finally spoke. She's very observant. Ethan smiled. That's good, isn't it? Margaret dried her hands slowly. Maybe. He noticed hesitation in her voice. What is it? Margaret looked toward the living room, where Vivian sat scrolling calmly through her phone. She listens carefully to everyone else. Then Margaret lowered her voice slightly. But she never really says anything about herself. Ethan laughed softly at the time. But years later, he would remember that sentence almost word for word. The following year, Vivian transformed Ethan's life faster than he could emotionally process. She connected him with investors, helped him leave his unstable job, supported him financially while he built his own consulting business. Then came the penthouse, the luxury vacations, the expensive social circles, the lifestyle Ethan once believed belonged only to other people. Every problem seemed to disappear around Vivian, and little by little, he stopped noticing how much power that gave her. Whenever he tried paying for something himself, she would smile softly. You don't have to struggle anymore. At first, it sounded loving. Eventually, it began sounding instructional. Months later, the emotional shifts became subtler. Vivian never directly demanded Ethan cut people off. Instead, she reframed them. Your friend Daniel only calls when he needs money. Claire doesn't respect our marriage. Your mother depends on you emotionally too much. The comments always arrived gently, reasonably, almost lovingly. And because there was never a dramatic confrontation attached to them, Ethan rarely defended anyone strongly. He simply drifted farther away over time. One night, he noticed he had ignored 3 calls from Claire without realizing it. Vivian rested her head lightly against his shoulder. I just want peace around us. And somehow, that sentence made distancing himself from everyone feel responsible instead of dangerous. 3 years into the marriage, Margaret suffered a mild fall while grocery shopping alone. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to concern Ethan. He immediately suggested she stay with them temporarily while recovering. Vivian agreed almost too quickly. Of course, she said warmly. We're family. Margaret moved into the East guest wing the following week. At first, everything appeared normal. Vivian hired additional staff, ordered special meals, even arranged physical therapy consultations. But then small things began changing quietly. Margaret's meals arrived separately. Staff redirected her away from formal guest areas. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. And whenever Ethan noticed tension, Vivian already had a calm explanation waiting. She prefers privacy. She gets overwhelmed socially. She said she feels more comfortable alone. Margaret never contradicted those explanations directly, but she also never fully confirmed them either. And that silence slowly became its own kind of warning. Late one night, Ethan walked downstairs searching for water after waking unexpectedly around 2 in the morning. The house remained dim and silent. As he passed the east hallway, he noticed a maintenance panel near the ceiling partially open. A small security light blinked behind it. Curious, he stepped closer. Inside sat a newly installed surveillance monitor connected directly to cameras facing the guest wing corridor. Margaret's corridor, not the rest of the house, just hers. Ethan stared at the screen silently. Then Vivian's voice appeared behind him. You're awake late. He turned sharply. When were these installed? Vivian barely glanced at the monitor. Security upgrade. For my mother? Vivian crossed her arms calmly. She's older now. If she falls again, we'll know immediately. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about her expression didn't. Because while speaking, she never once looked at the monitor. She looked directly at him, studying his reaction carefully. And for the first time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar standing beside his wife. Not comfort, not admiration, caution. The following morning, Ethan stood inside the kitchen reviewing emails on his tablet while staff moved quietly around him preparing breakfast. Margaret entered slowly wearing a light gray sweater, one hand resting gently against the counter for balance. Good morning, Ethan said. She smiled faintly, but before she could sit down, one of the house staff approached looking nervous. Mrs. Hale requested breakfast be served upstairs today. Margaret paused. Oh, all right. Ethan looked up immediately. She always eats down here. The employee lowered her eyes. I'm just following instructions, sir. Margaret quickly intervened before tension could grow. It's fine, really. But Ethan noticed something disturbing. She sounded practiced, like someone who had already learned how to minimize her own humiliation before anyone else had to acknowledge it. Later that afternoon, another small incident happened. Margaret searched quietly through the upstairs bathroom cabinet while Ethan helped her. My medication should be here somewhere. Together they checked every shelf twice. Nothing. Vivian appeared in the doorway moments later. "Oh," she sounded mildly surprised. "I told staff to move expired medication downstairs." "It wasn't expired," Margaret said softly. Vivian gave a tiny shrug. "Mistakes happen." But after Vivian walked away, Ethan noticed Margaret staring silently toward the hallway. Not angry, not confused, afraid. That night, rain pressed softly against the massive bedroom windows while Ethan sat across from Vivian inside their private lounge area. He finally decided to confront her carefully. "You've been treating my mother differently." Vivian continued reading through documents on her laptop. "In what way?" "She feels isolated." Vivian sighed almost impatiently. "Ethan, your mother is emotionally fragile." "That doesn't answer my question." Now Vivian slowly closed the laptop. And suddenly the atmosphere shifted. Not explosive. Controlled. Dangerously controlled. "I've spent months trying to help her feel comfortable here. You installed cameras outside her room. For safety. You moved her meals. She asked for privacy. She never said that." Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Are you calling your mother a liar? Or me?" The question landed exactly where she intended. Ethan hesitated, and she saw it immediately. Then Vivian softened her voice again. "That's the problem." "What problem?" "You're allowing guilt to cloud your judgment." Ethan stared at her silently. Because somehow, within only minutes, the conversation had shifted from her behavior to his emotional instability. And the frightening part was, he could actually feel himself beginning to doubt his own memory. Across town, Ethan sat inside a nearly empty cafe near the industrial district after receiving an unexpected text message earlier that morning. A woman in her late 40s approached his table nervously. "Mr. Hale?" "Yes." She sat carefully. "My name's Teresa. I used to work at your house." Ethan immediately recognized her. She had left suddenly several months earlier. Vivian claimed she had family problems. Teresa looked visibly uncomfortable. "I shouldn't even be here." "Then why are you?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Because your mother reminds me of mine." Ethan's expression tightened. Teresa explained slowly. At first, Vivian treated Margaret politely whenever Ethan was present. But the moment he left, meals arrived late. Staff were instructed not to engage socially. Margaret's requests were ignored. House rules became increasingly humiliating. "She wasn't screaming at her," Teresa said carefully. "That's what made it disturbing." Ethan remained silent. "Your wife likes control," Teresa continued. "She especially likes controlling people who depend on her." Then Teresa revealed something worse. Several staff members had quit privately over the same concerns. But Vivian always controlled the narrative afterward. She made everyone sound unstable. Before leaving, Teresa leaned forward slightly. "Your mother isn't confused, Mr. Hale." Then she stood and walked out into the rain, leaving Ethan sitting alone with a truth he no longer knew how to ignore. 2 nights later, the grand ballroom inside the Crescent Hotel glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, while photographers crowded around city officials and wealthy donors. Vivian moved through the room effortlessly. Elegant, composed, admired. Everywhere she walked, people smiled warmly. "She's incredible. She does so much charity work. She's one of the few wealthy people who actually cares." Ethan stood beside her hearing every compliment. And for the first time, they no longer sounded reassuring. Meanwhile, outside the hotel entrance, Margaret sat alone inside the back seat of the driver's car. One of the staff members had quietly instructed her to remain there because the ballroom might become overwhelming. Through the rain-covered window, she watched guests laughing beneath golden lights she would never enter. Inside the gala, Vivian stood at the podium delivering a speech about compassion. "No one should ever feel abandoned," she told the audience warmly. Applause filled the room instantly. Ethan looked toward her, then toward the entrance doors, and suddenly, the contradiction became unbearable. Later that weekend, Vivian hosted an intimate private dinner inside the mansion for several investors and political guests. Everything had been staged carefully. Candle lighting, live violin music, imported wine, formal table placement. Margaret rarely joined these events anymore, but Vivian personally invited her that evening, which immediately made Ethan uneasy. Halfway through dinner, Margaret's hand trembled slightly while reaching for her glass. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth. The conversation stopped instantly. Margaret looked horrified. "Oh goodness, I'm sorry." Before Ethan could react, Vivian smiled softly. "It's all right." But there was something wrong with the smile. Tiny, brief, almost impossible to notice unless someone was already watching carefully. Enjoyment, not empathy. One guest awkwardly looked away. Another forced a polite laugh. Margaret quietly dabbed the tablecloth with shaking hands while apologizing repeatedly. Vivian leaned back calmly, observing the discomfort spreading across the room. And for the first time, Ethan saw it clearly. His wife didn't simply dislike humiliation. Sometimes, she created it. The following morning, Ethan visited his financial advisor after noticing several unusual notifications from shared accounts connected to Vivian's corporate network. The advisor looked uncomfortable almost immediately. "There have been structural changes." "What kind of changes?" "Asset protection revisions." Ethan frowned. "Why wasn't I informed?" The advisor hesitated carefully. "Mrs. Hale authorized updated limitations several weeks ago." Several weeks ago. Before the dinner confrontation. Before the suitcases. Before any open conflict. Ethan stared silently at the paperwork. His direct access to multiple accounts had been restricted. Properties had been restructured under holding groups connected almost entirely to Vivian. Even the mansion technically belonged to her company now. Not them. Her. A cold realization settled over him slowly. The dependency he once considered love had been carefully engineered into permanence. The following evening, Claire arrived at the mansion unannounced. The atmosphere changed the moment she stepped inside. Even the staff looked tense. Vivian descended the staircase, slowly, wearing a calm smile. "Claire, this is unexpected." Claire didn't return the smile. "I came to see my mother." Vivian folded her hands lightly. "She's resting. I'll decide that myself." The tension between both women immediately filled the room. Ethan stepped between them carefully. "Please, not tonight." Claire turned toward him sharply. "That's the problem, Ethan. It's always not tonight." Vivian remained strangely calm, almost amused. Then Claire said something that shifted the room completely. "She's done this before." Silence. Ethan stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Claire looked directly at Vivian now. "I looked into her first marriage." Vivian's smile disappeared instantly. Only for a second. But Ethan saw it. Claire continued. "Another financially struggling man." Ethan's chest tightened. "Claire. He lost contact with his family too." Vivian's voice finally hardened slightly. "You should leave." But Claire wasn't looking at Vivian anymore. She was looking at her brother. Ask yourself why every person who gets close to her eventually becomes isolated. And for the first time, Vivian genuinely looked rattled. That night, Ethan woke suddenly around 3 in the morning after hearing movement downstairs. The hallway remained dark as he quietly walked toward Vivian's private office near the west wing. The office door sat slightly open. Inside, Vivian stood near the window speaking softly on the phone. Her tone sounded colder than usual. More honest. Ethan remained hidden near the doorway, listening carefully. "He's becoming difficult." Silence followed. Then Vivian spoke again. "No. Once she's gone, he'll stop resisting." Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. She continued pacing slowly. "He still feels responsible for her." Another silence. Then, "I know what I'm doing." Ethan shifted slightly, trying to hear more. But the floor creaked beneath him. Vivian stopped talking instantly. The silence inside the office became absolute. Then slowly, she turned toward the doorway. Ethan stepped back into darkness before she reached it. Moments later, he heard the office door close quietly. And somewhere deep inside himself, something finally began breaking apart. The next evening, Margaret sat alone in the rear garden beneath dim hanging lights while cold wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the property. Ethan joined her quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret finally asked, "Do you still love her?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know." Margaret nodded slowly, like she had expected that answer already. She wasn't always like this. Margaret looked down into her tea. "No." Then after a long pause, "She's afraid of me." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Margaret's eyes lifted toward the house, toward the glowing upper windows where Vivian moved somewhere inside the enormous mansion. Because I know something about her. What? Margaret hesitated. And for the first time since moving into the house, Ethan saw genuine fear in his mother's face. Not fear of humiliation. Not fear of conflict. Fear of consequences. Then she whispered quietly, "Some people don't want love." Ethan stared at her. "They want possession." Before he could ask anything else, Margaret stood slowly. "I'm tired." And she walked back toward the house, leaving Ethan alone beneath the garden lights, with more questions than answers. The following morning, Ethan stopped by the home office searching for property documents connected to the financial restrictions. Instead, he found a sealed folder partially hidden beneath Vivian's desk drawer. Margaret Hale, cognitive evaluation. Ethan's pulse quickened immediately. He opened the file carefully. Inside were printed medical observations describing memory instability, emotional confusion, dependency symptoms, possible cognitive decline. But something felt wrong immediately. The formatting looked inconsistent. Several signatures appeared scanned. Dates didn't align properly. Then Ethan noticed handwritten notes attached near the final page. Recommend assisted residential placement. His chest tightened, because suddenly, the suitcases made sense. The cameras made sense. The isolation made sense. Someone had been building a case. Not to care for Margaret. To remove her. And the worst part was, it looked official enough to succeed. That evening, the mansion felt unnaturally still. No music played downstairs. No staff moved visibly through the hallways. Even the air inside the house seemed tense. Ethan entered the private dining room holding the medical file tightly beneath his arm. Vivian already sat at the table waiting for him. A single untouched plate rested in front of her beside a glass of wine. "You missed lunch," she said calmly. Ethan dropped the folder onto the table. The papers slid across polished wood. Vivian's eyes lowered briefly toward the documents. But her expression barely changed. "You forged medical evaluations." "No. You tried to have my mother removed." Vivian folded her hands slowly. "I tried to protect our life." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Our life? She's destabilizing you. She's my mother. And I'm your wife." The sentence landed sharply. Not loud. Not emotional. Possessive. Ethan pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. "She's terrified in this house." Vivian finally looked irritated. "For months I've tolerated being treated like a villain because your family refuses to accept boundaries." "Boundaries?" Ethan repeated quietly. "You isolated her." Vivian leaned back slightly. "I created structure. You monitored her. She needed supervision. You tried to label her mentally unstable." Vivian's voice hardened for the first time all evening. "Because nobody listens until things become official." Silence filled the room. Heavy. Breathing became the only sound between them. Then Vivian spoke again. Quietly. Carefully. "For years I helped build your future." Ethan said nothing. "I gave you stability." Still nothing. "And now suddenly I'm the enemy because your mother whispers fears into your ear?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." His voice lowered. "You became the enemy when you started treating people like objects." For the first time, Vivian's composure cracked slightly. Only slightly. But enough. Then she asked the question she had clearly been avoiding. "If it comes down to her, or this marriage." She paused. "Who are you choosing?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. And somehow, that silence frightened Vivian more than any argument could have.